Take a look around you. The reality you are currently navigating is not an accident. It is the physical manifestation of your daily concessions, the silent accumulation of hours surrendered to comfort, and the predictable result of running away from your own latent potential. Most people spend decades operating on an unexamined loop. They wake up entirely exhausted, instantly submerged in a reactive state, consuming the creations of others while neglecting their own calling. They mistake the passage of chronological time for actual living, endlessly waiting for a monumental shift or a perfect alignment of circumstances that will never arrive. But true transformation does not belong to the distant horizon or the grand theatrical breakthroughs. It belongs entirely to the next 90 days. A 3-month window is a psychological sweet spot. It is brief enough to command your absolute focus, yet long enough to completely dismantle your old identity and replace it with something formidable. This is not an invitation to be entertained. This is a deliberate psychological re-engineering process designed to provide you with an unshakable, brutal architectural framework for your life. We are replacing fleeting inspiration with absolute discipline, clarity, momentum, and profound self-trust. Discipline is the core mechanism that operates when your emotions refuse to cooperate. It carries you through the quiet, freezing dawns and the long, agonizing stretches when quitting presents itself as the easiest alternative. Clarity serves as your internal compass, ensuring your scarce cognitive energy is never hijacked by digital noise or trivial obligations. Momentum provides the undeniable psychological validation that evolution is already taking place under the surface. And confidence is the ultimate psychological premium earned by keeping the promises you make to yourself. The fundamental challenge starting today is simple. You must claim 1 single hour every single day where you are entirely unreachable to the external world. 60 minutes dedicated exclusively to constructing a superior skill, fortifying your physicality, or brutally auditing the invisible cognitive traps that have kept you stagnant for years. If you guard this narrow window with your absolute life, the shift will manifest long before the final deadline. You will observe a distinct evolution in how you perceive reality, how you make decisions, and how you carry yourself through the world. Imagine the profound self-respect of looking back after 3 months and possessing undeniable, concrete evidence of your own execution. This requires a fundamental understanding of the 4% rule. 1 hour represents exactly 4% of your 24-hour day. While the majority of society overestimates what they can achieve in a single hyper-intense week, they completely underestimate the monumental trajectory shift that occurs when 4% of every day is fiercely protected and utilized with absolute intentionality. You do not need an overnight lifestyle overhaul. Radical, unsustainable overhauls simply trigger cognitive fatigue and inevitable collapse. What you truly require is an unyielding, protected system where building completely supersedes consumption. Consumption offers immediate emotional comfort, but leaves you fundamentally unchanged, while building induces friction but alters your trajectory permanently. To execute the 4% rule, you must first eliminate the surrounding environment noise. The modern world is explicitly engineered to fracture your attention span for commercial profit. The moment you step into your protected hour, you must enforce a state of absolute digital isolation. Your phone enters airplane mode. Notifications are terminated. Doors are locked, and your workspace is stripped down to bare execution. This deliberate act of boundary setting signals to your subconscious mind that you are finally taking your existence seriously. Within this sacred window, you select one solitary priority. Multitasking is a cognitive illusion that diffuses your power and breeds mediocrity. By channeling your entire cognitive faculty into a single meaningful task, you trigger deep focus, allowing your mind to become entirely absorbed by the work. Some days this hour will flow with remarkable fluidity, while other days will feel like an absolute psychological war against your own internal resistance. Understand that this internal resistance is not a sign of failure. It is the precise physiological sensation of old neural patterns being overwritten by intentional discipline.
Over time, this daily anchor will stabilize your mindset when external reality becomes chaotic. It shifts your baseline identity from someone who merely wishes for change into someone who consistently enforces it. The compound effect of this practice is mathematically staggering. 90 hours of pure, unadulterated focus over the next 3 months will push your development further than the average person progresses in multiple years of distracted, half-hearted effort. The transformation begins quietly beneath the surface, much like roots anchoring deep into the earth before the first branch breaks through the soil. You are cultivating a profound sense of personal gravity, an internal fortitude that ceases to rely on external validation or emotional motivation. Winning this 90-day evolution, however, is directly contingent upon how you manage the opening sequence of your day. If your initial waking moments are chaotic and undisciplined, the remainder of your day will inevitably mirror that identical script. True mental clarity cannot be found in the frantic middle of the afternoon when your cognitive energy is already fractured by external demands. It must be claimed at the absolute inception of the day, before the world is permitted to interfere with your cognitive state. Most individuals immediately surrender their cognitive sovereignty the moment they open their eyes by reaching for a digital device. They flood their waking brains with notifications, algorithms, and stress-inducing inputs, entering a state of hyper-reactivity before they have even taken a conscious breath. Winning the morning is not an arbitrary rule about waking up at an extreme hour. It is about establishing an intentional, unassailable framework during the first 30 to 40 minutes of your day to affirm that you are the sole director of your life. The first non-negotiable law of this morning sequence is the absolute banishment of digital inputs for the initial hour of consciousness. Your mind wakes up in a highly impressionable state, and protecting this window preserves your focus from being hijacked by external agendas. This is followed immediately by physical activation. You do not need a punishing fitness routine at dawn, but you require targeted physical movement to increase systemic circulation, sharpen your cognitive processing, and signal to your physiology that it is time for decisive action. Once your physiology is primed, you transition directly into defining your top 3 absolute priorities for the upcoming day. This structured intentionality eliminates decision fatigue and prevents you from drifting aimlessly through your afternoon. Finally, you integrate a brief period of mental alignment, using deliberate silence or focused reflection to anchor your mindset in absolute presence rather than ambient panic. Complexity is the ultimate killer of consistency, which is why this morning framework must remain exceptionally streamlined and execution-focused. When you string together consecutive mornings executed with this level of precision, you generate an invisible psychological momentum that naturally carries over into your afternoons and evenings. You stop negotiating with your immediate emotional weaknesses and begin operating from an entirely new baseline of self-conduct. The person you are becoming is forged in these quiet, unglamorous early moments when no one is watching and when your feelings are whispering excuses to return to comfort. True transformation completely rejects the illusion of short-term intensity and relies entirely on the relentless execution of daily consistency. Every single sunrise presents a clean, cognitive slate, a critical inflection point where you either choose to repeat the structural failures of your past or actively build the architecture of your future. By choosing yourself before the world has a chance to demand your attention, you insulate your mindset from stress and become completely unshakable over the next 90 days.
True transformation is an exercise in brutal subtraction. While the majority of self-improvement literature obsesses over what you need to add to your life, new routines, extra habits, complex tracking systems, the elite understand that your elevation is entirely throttled by what you refuse to eliminate. You cannot construct a monument of personal excellence on top of a foundational substrate of self-sabotage, chronic distraction, and toxic behavioral loops. If your internal architecture is riddled with energy leaks, adding more positive inputs is equivalent to pouring clean water into a shattered vessel. To make these next 90 days a definitive demarcation line in your existence, you must develop the psychological courage to aggressively cut what weakens you. Change does not require a sudden surge of temporary willpower. It requires the systematic dismantling of the environments, behaviors, and associations that keep you weak. Look back at your historical trajectory. The reason your previous goals collapsed was rarely a deficit of talent or potential. It was because you allowed the invisible gravity of old comforts to coexist with your new aspirations. You attempted to build a disciplined identity while maintaining an environment explicitly designed to fracture your focus. For the next 3 months, your primary objective is to audit your life with absolute clinical detachment and isolate the primary elements that drain your cognitive bandwidth, dilute your focus, and erode your self-respect. If a habit, an environment, or a relationship consistently compromises your standards, it must be excised from this chapter of your evolution. We begin with the absolute elimination of cognitive noise. The modern mind is constantly inundated with digital junk food, sensationalized news cycles, algorithmic social feeds, and microbursts of hyperstimulation that fracture your attention span. This constant consumption forces your brain into a chronic state of low-level anxiety and cognitive fatigue. When you surrender the first hours of your day to this digital matrix, you are effectively depleting your scarce executive functioning before you ever attempt meaningful work. Cutting cognitive noise means implementing strict digital boundaries. It requires you to ruthlessly curate your inputs, unfollow platforms that monetize your insecurity, and establish absolute periods of intellectual isolation where the external world is flatly denied entry. The second area demanding systematic subtraction is your physical and digital environment. Your surrounding architecture dictates your default behavior far more than internal motivation ever will. If your physical workspace is a chaotic mess of clutter, unorganized documents, and ambient distractions. Your brain will subconsciously mirror that exact internal state. Clutter represents a visual tax on your working memory, forcing your brain to expend subconscious energy, filtering out irrelevant stimuli. Over these 90 days, you must declutter your environment with aggressive intentionality. Strip your workspace down to the bare essentials required for execution. Apply this same clinical minimalism to your digital environment. Purge your desktop, delete non-essential applications, silence non-human notifications, and close every browser tab that does not directly serve your immediate objective. A clinical, streamlined environment transforms discipline from a painful, conscious choice into your effortless default setting. Beyond the physical and digital space, you must address the unseen emotional drains that actively compromise your discipline. These leaks often manifest as ambiguous commitments, unresolved interpersonal friction, or a chronic inability to establish boundaries. Emotional exhaustion is a primary catalyst for behavioral relapse. When your emotional reserves are entirely consumed by external drama or unchosen obligations, your capacity for self-regulation collapses. Protecting your 90-day trajectory means learning the sovereign power of a definitive negative. You must establish unshakable boundaries around your time and mental energy, recognizing that saying yes to trivial external demands is fundamentally saying no to your own development. This does not require hostility. It requires an uncompromising commitment to your own psychological preservation. Simultaneously, you must target the insidious behavioral patterns that actively sabotage your progress. These are the micro-concessions you make when no one is watching. Hitting the snooze button, extending your evening entertainment loops into your sleep window, or indulging in sensory coping mechanisms when stress levels rise. These behaviors are deceptive because they present themselves as harmless, momentary comforts. In reality, they are silent contracts with mediocrity. Every time you indulge a self-sabotaging impulse, you are actively training your brain to prioritize immediate emotional relief over long-term self-respect. To break this cycle, you must map your triggers with clinical precision. Track the exact moments your discipline slips. Decode the underlying emotional discomfort you are attempting to escape, and aggressively replace those automated default behaviors with intentional, constructive alternatives. The final element of subtraction requires you to reevaluate your relationship with comfort itself. Modern society has engineered a reality where discomfort can be entirely avoided at the push of a button. While this hyper-convenience offers immediate gratification, it creates deep physiological and psychological stagnation. True transformation occurs exclusively in the presence of friction. Growth requires you to step directly into the cold, the heavy, and the challenging. When you consciously choose short-term effort over short-term ease, you are systematically fortifying your mind against future adversity. To operationalize this strategy, immediately execute a 3-column audit. Detail exactly what weakens your mind, what compromises your physical environment, and what fractures your daily discipline. Be unforgivingly honest with your assessments. Identify the 3 most significant energy drains across these lists and eliminate them entirely. for the remainder of this 90-day window. The simple act of removing these behavioral anchors will accelerate your trajectory faster than any new habit ever could. As you clear the wreckage of your old patterns, you create an open, high-leverage mental space that allows for the cultivation of deep focus. Deep focus is the definitive cognitive separator of our era. We are living through a massive societal bifurcation where a tiny minority controls their attention span, while the vast majority surrenders their cognitive autonomy to algorithmic manipulation. In an environment defined by chronic distraction, the capacity to lock your mind onto a single complex objective for hours at a time is nothing short of a superpower. Time is not your limiting factor. Your primary bottleneck is the systematic leak of your attention. A single hour executed in a state of absolute cognitive immersion yields a higher quality of output and deeper skill acquisition than an entire week spent in a state of fractured multitasking. Deep focus is the mechanism that translates raw potential into undeniable world-class execution. Entering this state requires you to treat your attention as a finite, highly valuable currency. When you allow your focus to be constantly interrupted by incoming messages or browser shifts, you incur a massive cognitive penalty known as attention residue. A fraction of your mind remains tethered to the previous distraction, preventing you from ever reaching the deeper layers of intellectual processing where true breakthrough occurs. For the next 90 days, you must train your mind to stay. When the inevitable impulse to seek stimulation arises during your focus blocks, consciously acknowledge the discomfort and remain anchored to the task. Each time you override the urge to escape, you are physically strengthening the prefrontal networks responsible for long-term discipline. You are shifting your identity from a fractured reactor into a deep, deliberate creator. When you strip away the romanticized myths of talent and destiny, you are left with a cold, mathematical reality. Your value to the world is directly determined by the rarity and leverage of your skill set. Hard work in isolation is entirely insufficient. You can expend a massive amount of physical and emotional energy completing low-value tasks, but if those tasks do not actively upgrade your internal capabilities, you are simply running on a treadmill of hyperactive stagnation. You will finish the week exhausted, but your position on the board will remain entirely unchanged. If you want these 90 days to serve as a permanent inflection point in your socioeconomic and personal trajectory, you must pivot from mere effort to aggressive, deliberate skill acquisition. You must choose to build capabilities that pay you compounding interest for the rest of your existence. A premium skill is the ultimate form of leverage. It alters the physics of your life, allowing you to produce disproportionate results with the same 24 hours available to everyone else. The majority of society remains trapped in a low-leverage loop because they sell their raw time rather than their specialized competence. They focus heavily on immediate tasks, checking arbitrary boxes to satisfy external demands, while completely neglecting the systematic training of their own minds. To break out of this paradigm, you must adopt the perspective of an elite behavioral craftsman. For the next 3 months, you must dedicate your protected hours to the uncompromising cultivation of a high-impact competency. Whether that is advanced technical architecture, high-ticket communication, data synthesis, deep physical mastery, or the systematic architecture of psychological self-control. The initial phase of this process demands absolute precision in your target selection. You cannot master 5 skills simultaneously. Attempting to do so will simply fracture your cognitive reserves and lead to universal mediocrity. You must isolate a single high-leverage capability that, once acquired, will fundamentally upgrade your entire personal and professional reality. This choice must be guided by strategic utility rather than passing curiosity. Ask yourself, what specific capability would render the next version of your identity entirely formidable? Once that target is established, your position as a passive observer is officially terminated. You enter the arena as a radical student of execution, committing to a structural cycle of deliberate practice, targeted feedback, and rapid replication. Deliberate practice is fundamentally distinct from casual repetition. It requires you to operate consistently at the absolute outer edge of your current cognitive or physical limitations. It is an intensely uncomfortable process because it forces you to confront your inefficiencies with clinical transparency. If you are practicing a skill and it feels easy, fluid, and comfortable, you are not growing. You are simply reinforcing neural pathways that already exist. True skill acquisition demands that you intentionally design friction into your training blocks. If your focus is high-level communication, you must record your execution, dissect every vocal inflection, and dismantle your structural errors with unforgiving objectivity. This state of conscious correction is the exact crucible where elite competence is forged. Simultaneously, you must accelerate your development by aggressively hunting for reality-based feedback. The amateur isolates themselves from critique to protect their fragile ego from discomfort, while the professional views objective feedback as the most valuable metric in existence. Feedback is the ultimate optimization mechanism. It strips away your subjective illusions and shows you precisely where your execution falls short of excellence. Over these 90 days, you must subject your progress to the unyielding parameters of real-world testing. Analyze the data, measure your output against objective standards, and treat every failure not as an emotional indictment, but as high-value diagnostic information. When you remove the emotional charge from critique, you gain the ability to iterate at a velocity that leaves your peers completely behind. This rapid iteration cycle transforms theoretical knowledge into deep physiological instinct. True mastery occurs when a skill moves from the conscious, labor-intensive regions of the brain into the automated pathways of subconscious execution. This depth of integration cannot be achieved through sporadic, ad hoc study sessions. It requires the ruthless allocation of daily uninterrupted focus blocks. You must establish a highly structured rhythm within your 4% window. 15 minutes of pure conceptual analysis, 30 minutes of high-friction deliberate application, and 15 minutes of brutal self-review. When this exact architecture is repeated for 90 consecutive days, you accumulate nearly 100 hours of pure hyper-focused development. In the landscape of human performance, 100 hours of deliberate practice is an extraordinary amount of leverage. As your competence expands, you will observe a corresponding shift in your internal psychological state. Self-confidence is not something you can manufacture through empty mental hype or superficial affirmations. It is the natural psychological byproduct of demonstrated competence. When you know with absolute certainty that you possess a rare and thoroughly trained skill set, your anxiety evaporates and is replaced by a profound sense of personal gravity. You begin to move through the world differently, choosing your opportunities from a position of absolute strength rather than baseline desperation. This internal evolution completely rewires your baseline self-image, permanently aligning your identity with the standards of an elite performer. However, the acquisition of high-level skills is entirely contingent upon the internal climate of your mind. Long before your external execution collapses, your internal thinking has already sustained a fatal structural failure. Every problem you face in your physical environment, every missed target, every broken commitment, every descent into distraction is ultimately the downstream consequence of a fragile, unfortified mindset. Most individuals fail to alter their life trajectory because they attempt to fix external symptoms while completely ignoring the corrupted psychological operating system that generates those symptoms in the first place. You cannot construct an exceptional life on top of a mind that is fundamentally ruled by emotional volatility, conscious biases, and chronic self-doubt. Your mindset is the foundational filter through which all external reality is interpreted and acted upon. When that filter is weak and undisciplined, even the most basic tasks take on a crushing psychological weight. A single minor setback, an unexpected delay, or a moment of physical fatigue is interpreted as an existential crisis, triggering a complete collapse of discipline. To ensure these 90 days yield a permanent transformation, you must treat your mind not as a static entity, but as a dynamic asset that requires daily, systematic fortification. You must actively train your psychological infrastructure to become completely unshakable in the face of inevitable environmental friction. To fortify your internal architecture, you must first master the principle of radical, uncompromised ownership. The very microsecond you point an accusatory finger at external circumstances, your genetics, your past, your current financial limitations, or the volatility of your environment, you are actively participating in your own psychological castration. Ownership is not a moral assessment of blame. It is a tactical reclamation of power. When you declare that your current state is the exclusive responsibility of your choices, you simultaneously claim the absolute authority to rewrite your future trajectory. A formidable mindset completely rejects the role of the victim, stepping out of survival mode and entering the arena of absolute internal command. This command is maintained through the rigorous discipline of emotional regulation. The amateur is an absolute slave to their transient internal chemistry. If they wake up feeling motivated, they execute. If they wake up feeling fatigued, anxious, or uninspired, they retreat into comfort. This reliance on emotional alignment is a guaranteed recipe for long-term mediocrity. A premium psychological framework functions on a completely different premise. It builds a structural firewall between raw emotion and immediate physical action. You must learn the profound art of feeling resistance, exhaustion, or fear without granting those emotions the authority to dictate your behavior. You breathe through the chemical surge, pause with absolute clinical detachment, and execute based on your predefined standards rather than your immediate feelings. This internal discipline is further enhanced through the systematic practice of cognitive reframing. Human beings do not react to realities as it objectively exists. They react exclusively to the subjective narrative they wrap around that reality. A setback can be parsed as a devastating indicator of your inadequacy, or it can be clinically decoded as an essential diagnostic variable designed to optimize your strategy. The event itself is entirely neutral. The meaning you assign to it dictates your subsequent neurological state and behavioral output. When you consciously train your mind to filter every obstacle through the lens of performance feedback, you eliminate the emotional turbulence that typically causes people to abandon their commitments. This structural resilience ensures that you maintain absolute velocity over the course of these 90 days. Understand this clearly. You will be tested. Life will not politely clear a picky path for your self-improvement. You will encounter unexpected crises, systemic disruptions, and moments where your discipline feels entirely dry. The separator between those who evolve and those who remain permanently stuck is the speed of their recovery. When the amateur slips, they allow a single missed session to trigger a multi-week downward spiral of self-sabotage. The elite performer treats a slip as a momentary variance. They breathe, reset their coordinates, and re-enter the arena within the next immediate hour. Resilience is measured by the brevity of your behavioral lag time. To ground this mental fortification in daily practice, you must implement a clinical pattern interruption protocol. The moment your subconscious mind attempts to slip into old loops of procrastination, rationalization, or anxiety, you must forcefully disrupt the neural sequence. This requires physical and vocal immediacy. Stand up, alter your posture, change your immediate visual environment, and command your attention to return to the absolute present. You are actively training your brain to recognize that its old, survival-driven shortcuts are no longer tolerated under your new regime of self-conduct. You are systematically subtracting the mental clutter of self-criticism and doubt to expose a clean, high-leverage operating space. Once your internal climate is stabilized, you are finally prepared to face the heavy, uncomfortable realities you have spent years systematically avoiding. Avoidance is the ultimate architect of a stagnant life. It is a highly deceptive psychological defense mechanism that trades your long-term potential for short-term emotional convenience. Every critical confrontation you postpone, every financial deficit you refuse to audit, and every toxic behavior you pretend isn't a structural problem represents an active drain on your psychological capital. You carry the unspoken weight of these avoided obligations into every single hour of your day, fracturing your focus and eroding your core self-respect. The things you are running from are precisely the keys required to unlock your next level of capability. The difficult conversation you are delaying contains the precise boundary needed to protect your energy. The disordered metrics you refuse to look at contain the raw truth required to optimize your trajectory. Your highest evolution is always hidden behind the exact door you are most terrified to open. To break the paralyzing cycle of procrastination, you must stop waiting for a state of fearlessness that will never come. Courage is not the absence of internal friction. It is the absolute realization that your commitment to your future self is vastly more important than temporary emotional discomfort. To execute this confrontation successfully, you must clinically separate the task from the emotional charge your mind has attached to it. Write down the top 3 hard things you've actively avoided, bringing them out of the foggy realm of anxiety and into sharp, objective clarity. Overwhelm thrives in ambiguity. It shrivels in the presence of precision. Take these massive, intimidating problems and ruthlessly dissect them into small, mechanical, immediate actions. Set an uncompromised, definitive deadline on your calendar for each task. Treat these dates as sacred, non-negotiable appointments with your destiny, and take the first uncomfortable step with radical immediacy. The ultimate victory in this process does not lie in the external resolution of the problem. It lies in the permanent rewiring of your baseline identity. Every single time you step directly into discomfort and handle a situation you previously fled from, you send an undeniable concrete signal to your prefrontal cortex. I am no longer a person who hides from reality. I am a person who commands it. This shift in self-perception builds an unshakable internal security that completely alters how you move through the world. You release the ambient guilt of avoidance and unlock an immense reservoir of clean, focused energy that can be channeled directly into designing an environment explicitly engineered for your victory. Your environment is the invisible hand that shapes your destiny. You can possess the most sophisticated philosophy, the most intense desires, and the most meticulously designed goals. But if your surrounding architecture is actively hostile to your focus, your failure is statistically guaranteed. Human willpower is a finite, exhaustible cognitive resource. It is a biological battery that drains with every single decision, every resistance of temptation, and every forced redirection of attention. The amateur relies entirely on raw willpower to grind through a chaotic environment, while the elite behavioral engineer focuses their energy on designing a space where discipline becomes the path of least resistance. You do not need a new personality over these 90 days. You need an environment that wins for you. When your space is explicitly aligned with your standards, choices move from painful conscious effort into automated subconscious routines. The physical layout of your life is constantly feeding cues to your brain, triggering automated behavioral responses before your conscious mind can even intervene. If your immediate surroundings are cluttered, disorganized, and structured for instant gratification, your brain will perpetually default to low-leverage comfort. To break this cycle, you must audit the 4 distinct layers of your environment with clinical detachment: the physical, the digital, the social, and the mental. We begin with the physical space. Your room and your immediate workspace are direct reflections of your internal psychological climate. Every piece of unorganized clutter, every stray item on your desk, and every unmade bed represents a visual tax on your working memory. These are micro distractions that force your brain to expend subconscious energy, filtering out irrelevant data, drastically accelerating cognitive fatigue. Your objective is the absolute minimization of friction. Clean your environment with aggressive, minimalist intentionality. Strip your deep focus zone down to the absolute primitives required for execution. One notebook, one laptop, a tool of creation. Establish a sacred association with this space, teaching your neurology that when you enter this specific coordinate, production is the only legal option. Simultaneously, you must execute a comprehensive sanitation of your digital environment. Digital clutter is uniquely insidious because it is largely invisible until it has already fractured your attention span into 1,000 useless pieces. Modern software is deliberately engineered by psychological experts to hijack your dopamine pathways for commercial profit. Every notification sound, every unread badge, and every open browser tab is a direct assault on your cognitive sovereignty. To protect your 90-day trajectory, you must turn your devices into hyper-optimized tools rather than masters of your attention. Purge non-essential applications. Move highly addictive platforms off your primary screens, silence every non-human notification loop, and treat full-screen single-task execution as your absolute baseline digital standard. The third layer, requiring uncompromised architecture, is your social environment. Human beings are neurologically hardwired for tribal conformity. Your mirror neurons are constantly adjusting your baseline behaviors, vocabulary, and expectations to match the average standard of the people you interact with most frequently. If your primary circle operates with low standards, chronic rationalization, and an obsession with trivial entertainment, your mind will subconsciously lower its own parameters to remain aligned with the group. This does not require dramatic hostility. It requires the strategic management of access. You must establish strict boundaries around your time, reducing proximity to those who drain your internal reserves, while actively curating high-leverage inputs through premium content, masterworks of literature, and individuals who demand absolute excellence. The integration of these physical, digital, and social shifts ultimately cultivates a pristine mental environment. Your internal dialogue, the baseline narratives and interpretations running through your mind, is heavily dependent on the external input you allow past your psychological perimeter. When you systematically eliminate physical mess, digital noise, and social drama, your internal climate naturally shifts from a state of ambient survival panic into a state of deep strategic leadership. You stop wasting your scarce cognitive energy fighting your surroundings and allow your environment to carry you forward with an unshakable momentum. To ensure this momentum does not drift